Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. This is a 2018-19 video training for the school and district report card details. I'm Amelia Vargas, our reporting team lead analyst in accountability, and I'm also joined in the room by...
I'm John Weens. I'm the Director of Accountability Reporting and reporting here at the department.
So I work pretty closely on the school and district report cards, and last year, as many of you probably know, these were redesigned into two reports, which were released for the first time publicly, and that was the at-a-glance profiles and the accountability details reports. So this webinar is focused specifically on the details reports, and those are most similar in purpose and use to Oregon school and district report cards from previous years. And John, do you want to add anything before we get started, or?
No, I think I'll, well, no, not at this time.
And just to let you all know, those connected, please feel encouraged and welcome to interrupt us at any time with questions in the chat. We'll keep a close eye on that throughout the webinar. So this is our agenda for today. We'll get started by covering the most important details first. So that's going to be your important upcoming dates, validations that feed into the accountability details reports, and the appeals process. After that, we're going to review the final reports that were released last year, since the majority of those components for these new reports are not changing. And that includes things like looking at the level cuts, the student group disaggregations, and the indicators that are reported based on the different school types. And all of those are staying the same this year. Some changes are taking place on these reports though, so we'll discuss that following.
Turns out the audience is still seeing the title slide. Here we go.
Thanks for letting us know.
Okay.
So we've only moved one slide past the title, so that's just on the outline for today. This is also being recorded, so the video will be posted in the training webpage. So if you're not able to see the video now, I do recommend downloading the PowerPoint from that same page, which is now uploaded, so that you can follow along. It's a pretty visual training, so it would be helpful to have the PowerPoint as we move along. Can everyone hear us at this point? I just got a message in the chat that there's no sound. The 50-50. Sound is only through the phone, so it looks like if you're connected on a computer, you may need to call in order to hear the audio. Just dial in. Any other kind of technical questions before we get going? We have a question about discussing the timeline for the narrative section on the at a glance. This webinar is focused on the details, so I didn't include it, but you can find those timelines in the schedule of due dates and also in the AA update.
Yeah, and we can, I can text the timeline for that.
Sure,
later.
Yeah, we can definitely provide that. Okay, so getting started with some important dates to remember. So the validation for your details reports are going to open in July. You won't see it currently listed in the schedule of due dates since it's scheduled to open in July. And that date's July 18th, it's a Thursday. As you know, there are a number of validations opening before that date for other data collections that build the accountability details reports. And on the next slide, we're going to cover the list of those collections. One date that's highlighted here, though, now is August 23rd. So that's going to be your last date for changes to be made to assessment test records or third period cumulative ADM that will then appear in the final details report. So make sure that you're using the validations for these other data collections to make changes and corrections as much as possible. The validation for accountability details reports is going to close on October 2nd, followed by the final preview on October 3rd. And this is all through the Achievement Data Insight or the district secure website. And then there's the public release that follows a few weeks after that, and we don't have a specific date for that at this point.
Yeah, normally it's 1 week afterwards, but we have a lot of other considerations here. The governor's office often wants to look at the timing to make sure, so we have to align our timing with our release with what the governor's office is looking at. So the best estimate for release would be out around October 10th, but that date could change.
So moving on, this is a list of validations that build the accountability details report. With the exception of graduation, which, as you know, we always report the previous school year's results, so it's closed. These are the ones that will be opening, a couple of these today and this summer in general. The next slide has the list of their opening dates, which were announced in the May 30th Assessment and Accountability Update. And again, you'll see these in the schedule of due dates. Another detail to mention here relates to third period cumulative ADM. The audit window opened today at 1 and will run through the end of the day, Monday, June 17th. So this means that the collections reopen for all districts to review your audits for accuracy and make any additional changes that were missed during the collection window. Another thing just to point out, at the end of this slide deck, there's a list of contacts for each of these data collections so that you can contact the appropriate people for any questions or changes related to them. So again, we encourage you to rely on the validations for making changes that are going to impact your school and district details reports. The Oregon Department of Education, though, will continue to consider appeals regarding accountability data. These appeals must be in by August 15th to provide ample time to go through our appeals process. And if those get approved, we also need that space of time to get them processed in our database systems.
Yeah, the reason it takes some time is these accountability appeals are generally appeals that cannot be handled through the validation window or by editing data that can still be edited, such as third period. And so I know it's before the final version, but in order for us to meet our timelines, we need to have the appeals, just like Amelia said, we have to have the appeals in early enough so that we have time enough to work on them. Sorry, I babble.
No, that's perfect. So moving on to the accountability details report. So this year's reports are going to look very similar to last year's. You'll still be able to access last year's reports through the public and secure web pages. So this first link you see here is to our public space for downloading the reports, and it only includes suppressed data. When we publicly release the accountability details reports for the 2018-19 school year in October, this is where you would go if you wanted to have those available. And I'll just visit it now so that you guys can see what this looks like. So you can search for any school or district, and you'd be able to download the detail sheet here. And it's only going to be the suppressed version of the report. Our report card archive also has older reports, so those are the ones that existed before the redesign. And then this last link here is to the Achievement Data Insight, which is where you're going to go to preview the reports when the validation opens mid-July. So this is the only place where unsuppressed versions of the reports appear. And you'll also find last year's reports available there. And later in the webinar, we're going to walk through accessing ADI and how you can go about all the different functionalities there. Going back to last year's final reports, which is how you see them here. As a reminder, this is a non-identification year for schools, so there's not going to be any new schools identified for comprehensive support, since those are 3-year designations. And that's in part because we're working to keep our accountability system stable over the next 3 years.
Yeah. But we are identifying new targeted schools. The ESSA law does require annual identification of those schools.
That's right. And that also means we've been coordinating with our district and school improvement team to guide changes and things like managing what's to come. John, do you want to add anything related to school designations?
I think that's all of the designations from last year, the comprehensive and targeted designations, are carrying over this year. The idea is even if you're identified for targeted improvement, we want to provide support for multiple years, just not have it be a 1 year in, 1 year out deal. But we will be adding new targeted schools this summer, and Amelia's going to go into how we're going to display that in just a couple minutes.
Yes. So next we're going to look at the indicators that appear on these reports. So it varies depending on school type. This is kind of a high-level summary of these indicators. So depending on whether you're elementary and middle, combined, or high school, you're going to see a different number of indicators on the front page of the Accountability Details report. These indicators that are shown are what schools get rated on in order to determine a level of support, or the ESEA designation. Comprehensive support looks at the ratings on these indicators for the all students group, and targeted support looks at these same indicators for each of these different school types, but it's based on the ratings received by the student groups other than the all students group. So you can see at the bottom of this table the total number of indicators that appear based on school type. And what we'll look at next is the indicator ratings table as it appears on the front page of the Accountability Details report. So as a reminder, there are actually 12 student groups provided on these reports. For readability, you're only going to see the first 8 here at the top. The table provides a summary of the levels determined for each of the student groups and each of the measured indicators. Since we're looking at an elementary middle school, we see those 6 indicators. And when you look through the pages of the Accountability Details report, what you find are the percentages and the denominators for each of the 3 years of data that are used, and also a 3-year average. And you'll also see whether the level was determined by the current year or the 3-year average. And to make this a little bit clearer, what we'll look at next is one of the detail pages for the English Language Arts Achievement Indicator. That's a good question. So we have a question about there's not going to be new comprehensive schools, but new targeted schools, and that previously identified targeted schools stay with that designation. So that's correct.
Yes. Yes, any school that was identified as comprehensive last year will still have that designation on this year's report. Targeted schools, I'm just repeating here, schools that were identified as targeted last year, they'll see that designation again on this year's report, but we will also be adding new targeted schools this year.
So this is a page for the English Language Arts Academic Achievement Indicator. You'll see the district and school name at the top, and then there's an explanatory text about the data. Each indicator has its own set of level cuts. They go from 1 to 5, and they're defined on a 100-point scale. Up to 3 years of data are used for each school and each student group, so you can see those 3 years here, as well as a 3-year average. Not rated on will appear for those cases when the minimum N size of 20 is not met. So you'll see that here for the English learner student group. And then the higher of the current year or the 3-year average is what's used to determine the final rating. So you have a column here letting you know which of those two is what the student group's been rated on. And then, of course, your level fits right into there. So in this example, the higher between the 3-year average and the current year is the current year. So that's what it's rated on. Since it's a 35.6, you can see it's above the bottom of the level 2 cut, so it gets designated a level 2. And again, if there's any questions about this as we move along, please feel free to let us know. So this is now the indicator ratings table for high school. So again, there's 12 student groups on these reports, but for readability, you're just seeing the top 8. High schools are rated on 7 indicators. Combined schools are rated on 9, which in this table would include the ELA growth and math growth. And one thing you may be wondering is how these level cuts were determined for each of the indicators. So on the next slide, we have kind of that high-level summary of the methodology used. So there's some slight variation, as you noticed, from indicator to indicator. Another question in the chat about on track to ELP being for all students and English language learner groups only.
Yes, from Derek. So the on track to English language proficiency is calculated for English learners in the school. We don't disaggregate that further by race or ethnicity or by any other student group. So the ELP applies only to determining targeted identification for the English learner student group, and we also applied it to comprehensive identification for the all students group. And so that's why we show, it's the same data, but it's shown on the all students row and also on the English learner row. Since we're not doing comprehensive identification, the levels that you see for the all students group don't have an effect on school identifications this year, but they did last year. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, well, we're going to keep talking a little bit more about level cuts by the different accountability indicators. So these are what those individual levels look like for each of the indicators. And this is what you'll see in the top right of your details reports for each of the different pages associated with those indicators. John, did you want to maybe say a little about grades used and how that plays into the data that appears on the report?
Yeah, I think one of the ones that's more confusing or most confusing is regular attenders.
Right.
This was a little bit of a difficult decision, but because regular attendance varies so much by grade band, highest in elementary school starts to drop off in middle school and then gets even lower in high school. We did look at regular attenders by grade bands. One of the reasons was that the ESSA law requires these indicators to meaningfully differentiate schools. And if we use the same cuts at all grade spans, then high schools would generally be rated low, and elementary schools would all generally be rated high. And we wanted to be able to differentiate between attendance rates within a group of schools, like elementary schools, middle school, high schools. So we set different cuts. And so that means for each school, we choose one of those grade spans and report on that. So for high schools, we report in ninth, I'm sorry, I'm probably talking too long, but for high schools, we report 9th and 10th grade regular attendance. The reason we do just 9th and 10th grade is because those grades, at those grades, regular attendance is most strongly correlated with graduation outcomes. And we also wanted to include an early indicator, sort of a leading indicator for kids in high school, not a trailing indicator if we use just 12th grade attendance. If you look at, we have some schools that are combined schools that cross multiple grade spans. So if you're a K-8 school, for instance, what we did is we used the grade span that had the most kids. So for a K-8 school, that's usually K-5. For a K-12 school, it could be K-5 as well, but it just depends upon the distribution of kids in your school. So we used the grade span that had the most students in the all-student group, with the idea that if we did that, we would also be able to look at disaggregated data. We'd be more often be able to look at the performance of kids in disaggregated groups.
Good details. And the accountability system also has a process whereby individual student groups are not assigned a level 1 unless the student group is below the 10th percentile of performance for that student group. So that's mentioned here as this level 2 star. And this rule applies to student groups that have had historic achievement gaps compared to the state as a whole. And these overrides do not apply to ELA and math growth, nor the English learners on track indicator. But that is another detail that you'd see on these reports is a level 2 star.
And part of that was to help mitigate some of the features of the ESSA law so that it didn't look just like AYP did in the past. So for instance, if you have a significant, if you meet the minimum end for students with disabilities, if we didn't have different cuts for level 2, we would have identified many schools for the students with disabilities group. It would have increased the targeted schools count tremendously. And so instead what this override does is it helps us identify which schools are schools where the students with disabilities are struggling the most in the state. So we can try to focus resources on those schools where the students in that student group are struggling the most.
And this sums up the data elements, level cuts, and determinations that were finalized and implemented last year, and what you can expect to see persisting for this year. If you are interested in some more details, this is kind of where you can go for that information. We'll be updating with the 2018-19 technical manual for the accountability details report. There is also our archive page where you can go to view last year's report. So this includes all of the information about how the indicators are calculated, the rules for identification, those level cuts again.
And I think our plan is to not have separate documents this year, but hopefully produce one unified document for this coming summer. The rules are almost identical, but we hope to have one document. Is that the goal, Amelia?
Sure, yeah. I think a single document makes it nice. We have one thing that you download.
To be honest, we did multiple documents last year just because we were trying to get what we could out as fast as we could, and if we'd waited for a single document, it would have been taken a lot longer for us to put up any information about the accountability system.
Right. So we're looking to have those updated around August. And yeah.
As soon as we can get it done.
Okay, so next we'll go ahead and move on to the changes that you can expect to see on the report. So a lot of these are, not substantial changes, but they will make the reports look a little bit different. And there's essentially two categories of changes that we're implementing. So those would either be for readability purposes or for context. So the first one here is reordering the columns that appear on the front page. And what we're doing is just having growth closer to the subject that it's associated with. So for elementary and middle, you're going to see those columns shifted to be side by side. For combined schools, again, we're going to be moving growth next to the subject. And we're also moving the on track to ELP to follow regular attenders, which makes it consistent with where it appears for elementary and middle schools. So you see that here instead of the end. And again, part of the decision for the ordering of the columns is to make the report a bit more thematic. For high schools, what this looks like is, again, similar to what you just saw for combined schools. And what this also is going to do is sort of dictate the page order for the report to match the column order that you see here. So for example, if we look at an elementary and middle school, this is the page order that you'd expect to see. So again, we're moving participation to fit under the subject that it's associated with. And again, these aren't substantial changes, but we want you all to know that they were intentional, and you can expect to see them in the new report. Another change we'll be implementing is going to appear on the front page of the report. And this is an arrow that will show you the change in the level from the previous year. So if you're familiar with the at-a-glance reports, you'll notice, you'll recall that we had arrows next to the different measurements to indicate whether it was an increase or decrease. So this is the same sort of idea. No arrow appears when there is no change from the previous year's level. And the change is only being calculated based on that previous year. So it doesn't look at the previous 3 years, it's just based on the previous year change.
Yeah, this was a good innovation, Amelia. No, I think, is it Eric or Amelia? Anyway,
Someone had a good idea.
Someone had a good idea, I think, to talk about changes from year to year. Because hopefully this is a good added feature for everyone. We are not adding an arrow for a change from level 2 star to level 2. I believe that wasn't in the planning. The other thing to note is if you are not rated, we won't show an arrow either. There was a question about whether I'm sorry, you guys can't see some of these questions. There was a question about whether an arrow will be used if a school goes from, say, level 2 star to level 2.
Right.
In our specifications, we weren't going to indicate that that was an increase, although it actually is. Going from level 2 star to level 2 is actually pretty significant for student groups, especially groups like English learners or students with disabilities, and some other of the racial and ethnic groups that typically have achievement gaps. But we chose not to put an arrow there. Maybe after this year, we could potentially, based on reactions at the end of this year, we could potentially make a change for the year after. People prefer an arrow when we change from level 2 to level 2 star, or vice versa.
Right, and I think part of that was just trying to get clarification on the difference between a level 2 and a level 2 star in these reports. The other new sort of data elements that are going to appear on these reports take place in the bottom half of the front page. So this is where you'll find the level of support, whether or not participation targets were met, and other details. So highlighted here in purple are what's new. So for schools that were identified for targeted or comprehensive support, the first year of the identification will now appear. And then we're also going to be providing some references to the pages for the participation data. And regarding the year first identified, this detail may not even be applicable to a lot of schools. Our targeted and comprehensive schools last year totaled to 16%, which is roughly 200 schools out of 1,250. But it was a detail that our school improvement team recommended for these reports. And I think it's kind of been asked earlier, schools that may be exiting in a future year, if that's another detail that we want to start including on these reports, because it may become relevant or helpful to see it here.
Yeah, we don't have any schools exiting yet, because this year was just a planning year. But yeah, at some point we'll be exiting schools, we hope, we believe, and we'll indicate exited status on this as well as our plan.
There's a question in the chat about anything new being reported for participation, possibly including details on opt-outs.
Yeah, the one issue that we dealt with, I think, a little over a year ago was due to accessibility requirements for these documents, adding in columns for opt-outs versus non-opt-outs, non-participants makes it difficult to create these documents and keep accessibility. Also, another thing is we've seen a drop-off in the number of districts who are actually entering the opt-out code. So the code itself that we're getting is not as accurate as it used to be. So it really isn't, I would say we don't have a really, I think adding opt-outs would be not wise at this point for those two reasons.
Right. It's not really a reliable data element that we could include. Exit criteria, has those been defined yet or still to be determined? They are still to be determined.
I would say still to be determined. It's probably something that Tim Boyd's Districts and School Effectiveness team and us, we need to discuss this probably fairly soon, now that the first year of full implementation is coming up. I think in general, the idea is what got you in should get you out. But there's also, I believe, an intent to look at local data as well to determine exit status. But that's something that we'll have to communicate more on in the future. There's a question about the opt-out codes, and someone made a statement that it's very time-consuming to add the opt-out code to the test record. And that is a good point. It's something we need to discuss internally. Because when the opt-out code was first envisioned, we were thinking about doing some fairly public, well, we do produce an opt-out report every year. The idea was to determine how many students were just not participating versus those who did receive the opt-out form. We'll have to, I think we should have an internal discussion as to whether or not we need to continue that reporting in future years. That was a long, rambling answer. Good point about the opt-out code. It's something we need to discuss.
Is it possible to make the opt-out option an option in TIDE?
You know, TIDE is not my area. That's something, hopefully Cindy Barrick is listening and she can make notes. Another good question about whether the opt-out's an option in TIDE. Certainly not for the coming year, but it could be something we look at in the future.
I'm going to pull us back into the details reports for now. The next change and it's the last one actually, to these reports relates to the column headers that appear for the graduation pages. So last year's included the reporting year for these columns. So we're going back to how we've reported these in the past, which is by cohort year.
Yeah, we had discussions with some stakeholder groups about this, and there were some various recommendations. And then we came back and looked at accessibility options for screen readers and things like that, and we ended up settling with this as being a reasonable compromise. Reporting cohort year is always difficult. It's always confusing, and we've discovered that districts talk about cohorts differently. Some districts refer to 9th grade year, some districts refer to class of. So I know it's a difficult issue, but we decided to go back to what we traditionally report.
Right, and also what's consistent with our current cohort media file for graduation data.
Yeah.
So next, we're going to walk through the ADI validation, which is scheduled to open on July 18th. And here you'll see the purpose, and we do emphasize preview because it is important to try and rely on the validations for each of these collections to make changes necessary for your accountability data. And again, in the ADI, you're going to have access to unsuppressed versions of these reports. So this is probably going to look familiar to you all, the district secure site that you need to log into. You're going to select Achievement Data Insight from the list of applications that you see. If you don't see the ADI option, do contact your district security administrator in order to request that access. Once you've clicked in, you're going to see two tabs open, and all validations that are currently open are going to be under the Open tab. And the Close tab is where you're going to go to view last year's reports. So if you go there now, you can see the reports for last year. The tile is still named Report Card. And in the Report Card tile, you're going to also have the at-a-glance reports. So the at-a-glance validation opens a week after the details. So they wouldn't appear that first week that this validation opens.
And I believe the RC narrative opens the same day as the at-a-glance.
Is that right?
I believe so. Back to an earlier question. Not 100% certain?
So our data owner for the narrative collection says it's opening July 18th. So
that's a week before the at-a-glance.
The same date as this details report.
Thank you, Elise.
A week before the at-a-glance. Thanks, Elise. So this is an example of what you'll see once you've clicked on the tile for report card. And a larger version of this image is provided in the training materials for this, if you want to open that up. But what you're seeing here for each of the numbered items is also explained on the next slide. So number 1 here is the reporting year, and other years can be shown by using the drop-down menu. The validation text appears below that, which provides a brief description of the validation that's being viewed. The PDF tab is going to be the only tab you'll see on these reports, and what you'll see is the PDF downloads for the details or the at-a-glance reports. Filter would allow you to filter the validation data if you wanted an easier way to search, if you're looking at a number of different schools and only wanted to select a handful of those. And then page size on the bottom here allows you to adjust the number of rows shown on the page. And then at the very bottom here are just some general instructions and information about the validation and where the data are from.
I have one caution to add. I think we've been doing this for a few years, but even after we publish report cards, what used to be called report cards, now at-a-glance and detail sheets, we still make the unsuppressed versions available here. Mm-hmm. And so we have had a few occasions in the past where someone accidentally printed out the unsuppressed version from here, even after the public release, and shared it. So just be certain that if you're using this site to download anything that you're going to share, that you choose the suppressed versions. Mm-hmm. If you're going to share it externally.
Right. So kind of zooming in here on the ADI functionality. So again, under report type, you're going to either see details or at a glance. And in here, you're just seeing the details, which is the focus of the webinar. Some additional functionality that happens in the ADI, if you hover over a column for more information, or you can click on a header to sort it. So if you're a district, it might be helpful to sort by school names. You'll also see a column that indicates whether the report is suppressed or unsuppressed. So that's what John's sort of saying to be aware of and cautious of, whether you're sharing unsuppressed internally or externally. You want to make sure you're downloading the suppressed version.
Yes.
So you would click on the PDF in order to download the file. This sort of wraps up the webinar. At the end here is just a list of contacts for the different collections and validations that are opening up so that you can be sure to get in touch with those folks. Are there any lingering questions or?
There's another question.
So we do have a question here, whether the narrative sections on the at-a-glance reports have any changes this year. And whether the character limits will be the same.
And happily, Elise answered. So
They do not.
no changes, and the character limits are the same. We are working on the roll forward, though, so that what you entered last year can be rolled forward to this year's reports. And there's a question about, will this happen in August? I think that's referring to the at-a-glance.
To the narrative, or? Yes, the narrative.
So if it opens July 18th, I believe at that point you can execute the roll forward for schools.
Mm-hmm.
Although I shouldn't be talking because that's Elise's collection and I get it wrong.
Elise, correct us if we're wrong. You're correct.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for joining us. We'll hang out here for a few more minutes if you do have any other questions. Thank you all for participating. This is being recorded, so it will be posted on the video training page, so you can watch it posted on the YouTube channel.
Yes, it takes a couple of days for us to get it up, but it will be there.
And do reach out to us if you have questions following this.